Did you know emotions are at the root of why many people suffer, and that they're not universal? They are created on the fly by your brain. How do I know this? This book, How Emotions Are Made, Lisa Feldman-Barrett. A very interesting book. It's very dense. I haven't finished it yet, so I'm not doing a full book review. Today, I'm going to talk about an interview that I watched with Lisa and Steven Bartlett, who runs the podcast Diary of a CEO. Brilliant podcast, by the way. Thanks, Stephen, and all your team, because it's everybody that I ever want to hear from. It keeps popping up on your show. And the one with Lisa was very profound. And I do want to cover that today. I want to show you that the idea that emotions are central is really key, but that it's all about the meaning you make in the experiences you have, and it's not a universal experience. And so trauma isn't a set of experiences that everybody has. It's about you interacting with your environment. And in many ways, this is because the brain is a predictive organ. Okay, it takes an awful lot of your metabolic energy. It's up to 20% of everything that you produce is taken by your brain. And because it's energy hungry, it has to find shortcuts, if you like, ways in which it can make sense of your reality without having to pass all the information that's coming in. And so it's developed these predictive capabilities. And that's what the conversation between Dr. Feldman-Barrett and Steven Bartlett was really all about. But I can't tell you how important this conversation was, and how groundbreaking, illuminating, and personal. You know, she brought in lots of examples from her own life. And not only is she dismantling cultural myths and metabolic information, but she's also using her own family experiences, which I always value, because in this world of AI, for people to actually share their own experience is really key, I think, to feeling connected with them. That's why I do my podcast too. It's a 2-hour conversation, folks, and I'm not therefore going to be able to summarize everything in there, but to keep it to 20 minutes, half an hour, I'm going to just take out the key themes, I think. I did find it really scientifically rigorous, because this person, Dr. Feldman-Barrett, has been involved in scientific research for decades and producing work of the highest quality. So it's scientifically rigorous, but it's also very practical, because it teaches us ways in which we can enhance our experience of life. And that's where I think Steven was really important, because he was questioning her in some of the practical ways that you could adapt this information. So we're invited to consider the meaning of anxiety, for instance, to rethink trauma not as something that happens to us, but as something that we interpret and construct in our brains from the experiences we've had before, the patterning that has produced, and our interpretation, how this matches, this current experience matches. And the meaning can change depending on your cultural inheritance, your previous experiences, things that you're told. And so, again, it's made on the fly. And so by altering the predictions, by changing how we make meaning, that is how we can change our experience of life. And we can change, therefore, who we become, because we are really in the act of becoming all the time, based on what we think, feel, and say, and what we do, I think, which is also another factor that Barrett brought out really strongly, was that the actions that we take literally transform our experience of life. So it's not a message of naive optimism. It's not just saying think better thoughts. It's grounded in the neuroscience of prediction, to some extent also neurophysiology, and cultural inheritance, and the context in which the experiences you have occur. And I loved hearing her story about her daughter and how she helped her recover from depression. And so it really shows how these scientific insights can change lives. And in fact, that is her message. It's also her mission, because Stephen always asks, what's your mission? And hers as a science communicator is to change lives. And I really totally agree with that. And I hope I'm doing the same. So she is showing that the grounding principle is that The brain's operating system can be manipulated and changed, which gives ordinary people, without necessarily understanding the neurophysiology or the neuroscience, to gain agency in their lives. Agency is a really important word here, because when the world feels overwhelming and difficult, we often lose the idea that there's anything we can do to change it. And that's what agency is, a feeling inside that you have the resources you need to make the life you want. And so she's turning the old story that we're just passive recipients of experience and that our brains are decoding reality as it is, totally upside down. The brain is not decoding reality as it is, it's creating reality as it goes, and that reality is individual to you. Of course, there are shared features in that reality, but your internal perception is yours. And so the brain is not primarily reactive, but it's predictive. It's basing what it perceives on what it's already experienced in the past, and it's pattern matching to that experience. Now, I've talked about that before, but perhaps not in the same way that Dr. Lisa talks about it. So I think also giving somebody agency means that we get the chance to change things. Okay, and one of her really big quotes is, "You are responsible for changing something, not because you're to blame, but because you're the only person who can." Okay, so if you've had experiences in life that have changed you for the worse, you know, to make you anxious or overreactive or overthinking or hyper responsible, here is the answer. Okay, and when we say you're responsible for changing something, we don't mean it should be a burden on you. It means you have the ability to change your response. Okay, and because you're maybe at the end of the line here, a whole series of traumatic experiences for you and your family, and because you have this information, because you have people like Dr. Lisa around who can help you, and people like Bessel van der Kolk and Martha Beck, all of whom have been interviewed recently on Diary of a CEO. I don't know how he manages to get all the best people, but he does. These are people who've really thought hard and long about how it is we can transform our experience of life. And it's not just theory, it's practical. You see, if your brain is reacting, not predicting, then it's able to change the prediction if you take control, if you recognize, firstly, that you're in a predictive state, and even that your senses are coming in after you've predicted. So in actual fact, you act first and then you sense. This is important. You don't sense and then react. This is something she's discovered. We all tend to think logically, where we sense something in the environment and then we react to it. No, it's the other way around. You tend to react very, very quickly because these are predictive sequences. They're buried deep in your animal brain. They're designed to make a quick summary of what's going on and to respond accordingly. So you predict action and then you sense. This is really key. And you start to feel those sensations before the signals actually arrive for you to perceive them. So you feel them, but you're responding before you even have a chance to make sense of them cognitively. So you start to experience before you actually get a chance to make sense of the signals you're getting. And so understanding that turns everything around, doesn't it? And she went through some examples with an apple, and she showed Steven how our senses kind of predict stuff. And therefore, he wanted to know, is trauma therefore part of the predictive brain's response? And yes, Lisa feels it is. Trauma is not something that happens in the world to you. Okay, everybody agrees with this. Dr. Gabor Mate talks about this. Bessel van der Kolk, all the great trauma researchers understand that trauma is not the thing that happens to you. It's actually what happens inside of you, including in your brain and also in your physiology. And so everything you experience, including trauma, is a combination of the remembered past and the sensory present. Okay, and that's a quote she uses a lot through this conversation. The remembered past, which is helping to create the predictions, and the sensory present, what's going on inside, is actually feeding into your brain senses. I've talked about that a lot in various videos about anxiety, because anxiety often comes from the gut as well, or other organs. You know, once your heart starts beating faster, because your brain is predicting something bad, that sends a signal, your heart starts beating, that's a feedback signal that I'm in danger, and of course the whole thing escalates. So the sensory present is also really important. So what's going on inside your body is equally important as what's going on in your brain, because the two talk to each other. And so this is just really extraordinary. And I mean, it's a 2-hour talk, so I'm not going to be able to summarize absolutely everything. But what I loved was how wide-ranging it was. You know, we went from, as I say, metabolism, even body budgeting, as she calls it. You know, when you overdo your body budget, which is a lovely way of looking at it, things start to go awry. Okay, so we have a certain amount of energy which is available for all the functions of the body. And if we start to be in a totally stressed state all the time, our body budget goes out, and this affects our mental health, of course, and our metabolism, because gut health is so linked to mental health. And so we start to not be functioning well. So it's just really wide-ranging, this conversation. And another fact I thought was really important is that emotions are built, not triggered. Now, this is interesting, because in my work we do talk a lot about triggering. Triggering is when something in the present reminds the brain of past experiences and the meaning it made of them, and it sort of predicts the same response to this experience that it had to a similar experience in the past. But of course it makes mistakes occasionally, overestimates the threat. But the emotional part I haven't really looked at before. I know that emotions are super important for how we respond in our life. They are the way that we make sense of the world. It's the way we interact. They're the most important downloader of information, much more important than words, because they enable us to communicate as well and seek connection with others. Emotions are the primary method of that. And it used to be believed that the emotions were innate hardwired circuits in the brain. And indeed, early in her career, she described that, and she started to look for objective measures of anger, you know, heart rate increase, blood pressure changes, and so on. But the data never matched. And so she started to change her model and see that people are individually responding in ways that are unique to them. Yes, there are patterns, but there isn't a data set that you could say that is anger. These changes in the mind and body correspond to anger. So she drew the conclusion that there are, in fact, no universal signatures of emotions, and that's what the book's about. So there are no certain circuits that light up. You can't pattern it that way, but categories that our brains construct by predicting what sensations mean in the context that they're in. And so that's why emotions vary so much across cultures, because different cultures have different experiences, different understandings of meaning. So emotions are not reactions, but constructions. And this has enormous implications for my work, because I help people remake meaning, reconstruct meaning that isn't so threatening to them. When we use tools like EMDR, which is eye movements, that reconfigures certain brain circuits and it allows people to get connected to the reality rather than their prediction. So it's a completely new way of understanding this. So you can actually rebuild your responses. And they're not immutable states imposed upon us, but dynamic interpretations, absolutely open to change. And then the final part that I want to talk about today is how that changes how we understand trauma and the context of what we're experiencing. Now, in our culture, we have certain expectations in the Western culture that may not occur in Eastern cultures, for instance. And so if you grew up in a culture where children were regularly beaten, say, in fact, this did happen in the Victorian era, when the Victorians went to sort of conquer the world, sort of dominate other cultures, and they found that other cultures didn't beat their children. They found fault with that because they felt that beating your children was essential for creating discipline. So it's interesting, isn't it? And now we've turned full circle and we don't really allow, physical violence. Well, it happens, but it's not culturally supported. So it is context driven. And so trauma then isn't a fixed event lodged in memory. It's emerging from the meaning we make of experience, and that is contextual. Now, very carefully, we want to not deny the reality that people suffer, because undoubtedly they do. But neither are we suggesting that victims are culpable or to blame. We're not talking about blame here. We're talking about agency and the ability to transform, not what happens to you. You can't change that, but the meaning you've made of what happens to you. And therefore, the difference between blame and responsibility, which I am really careful to explain to people. Responsibility is about changing your response, making a new meaning. You can't control what happens. Specifically, you can't control what happened in the past, but you can sometimes reshape its meaning. And that is what enables the neurophysiology to rebalance itself and thus stop triggering these body responses, which contribute to anxiety and chronic pain and fatigue. And so I think this is really important, understanding that things are mutable, they are changeable, that you have much more control over your life, what she calls, you can be the architect of your own life. I loved that. For me, when I'm working with people, that's really what I'm here to help them do, is reconfigure their lives in a shape which matters to them, which has meaning for them, which meets their value systems, instead of being in a reactive, predictive state based on what their family of origin wanted or expected of them. So folks, I will put in the description below the full link to this interview. I think it's really important. I will be covering more next time because it's such a long interview and discussion. But for now, if any of this sounds interesting to you and you want to come and explore how to remake meaning in your life, then please find me on alchemytherapies.co.uk. That's it. Yeah. Okay. Take care. Bye for now. Bye.